I never thought a Christmas Eve could leave me feeling so shaken. My family has always kept things simple and cozy for the holidays. It was just me, my parents, and my little sister that night. We were in the middle of dinner when someone knocked on the door. It was odd because we weren't expecting anyone. My mom went to answer it, and to our surprise, it was my cousin Mark. He lived in another city, and honestly, we didn't hear much from him. Still, he showed up with a big smile, saying he was just passing through. My mom, being as polite as always, invited him in. It didn't seem like the best idea, but that's just how she is. He sat down and started chatting like he'd been part of the family all along. Something about the way his eyes darted around made me uneasy. He wasn't just sitting there, he was scanning every corner of the room. What really threw me off was when he started mentioning things about our routines, things no one outside our family should know, like what time my parents left for work or how my sister sometimes forgot to lock the door in the mornings. It gave me chills. We tried to keep the conversation going, but the air felt heavy, like we all sensed something was off. Being the oldest in the family, I've always felt like it's my job to look out for everyone. From the moment Mark walked in, I had this gut feeling that something wasn't right. He was polite, sure, but his curiosity seemed excessive. He asked about the neighbors, whether we traveled much, and even about the lock on the front door. It all felt like too much for someone just catching up. My mom started to look uneasy too, which only added to my growing sense of dread. My dad, on the other hand, doesn't have much patience for nonsense. When it became clear that Mark wasn't planning to leave anytime soon, he asked him outright why he was there. Mark gave this strange smile, like he'd been expecting the question, and said he just wanted to spend some time with family. But the way he said it gave me the creeps. Then, out of nowhere, he dropped a line that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm not alone." None of us knew how to react. He tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a figure of speech, but the way he glanced out the window told me otherwise. After he said that, none of us really knew what to say. The room went completely silent as we tried to figure out if he was joking or not. My dad, always the straightforward type, asked Mark what he meant by "I'm not alone." Mark just chuckled and brushed it off, saying it was just an expression. But the atmosphere in the room had already shifted. Something felt deeply wrong. I glanced out the same window Mark had looked at, but all I could see was our dark, empty backyard. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. Eventually, my dad had enough and told Mark it was time to leave. Mark stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket like he had all the time in the world. "I was just about to go," he said, but not before pausing at the door to stare at us. It wasn't just a casual glance. It felt like he was studying us, or maybe memorizing the layout of the house. When he finally stepped outside, we all let out a sigh of relief, but it didn't last long. I peeked through the window to make sure he was gone. His car was still parked on the street, but he wasn't in it. Instead, he stood in the dark, just watching the house, before disappearing into the shadows. That night felt like it would never end. After Mark left, none of us could relax. My mom tried to downplay it, saying maybe he was just going through something. But my dad and I weren't convinced. Before heading to bed, he asked me to double-check all the locks on the doors and windows. I made sure everything was secure, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. The image of Mark standing in the street, watching us, was burned into my mind. For the first time in my life, I grabbed a kitchen knife and put it next to my bed. I'd never done anything like that before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my heart race. It sounded like a faint scratching at one of the windows. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it, but then it happened again. I froze, listening intently, trying to figure out if it was real. Slowly, I got out of bed and walked to the window. When I looked out, the street was empty, but the ground below the window wasn't. There were footprints in the dirt, right outside. My stomach dropped when I realized the tracks didn't stop there. They circled the entire house. I didn't turn on the lights or wake anyone up. Instead, I crept back to bed and stayed awake until the sun came up. The next morning, my dad was the first one outside. I heard him calling for my mom in that firm voice he only uses when something's really wrong. I ran out to see what was going on, and there they were, footprints. They were everywhere, circling the entire house, like someone had been pacing around all night. But it wasn't just random. The track stopped at each window, as if whoever it was had been watching us from every angle. Some of the prints even led right up to the doors. My dad looked furious and immediately tried calling Mark, but of course, he didn't answer. What made it worse was when we noticed smudges on the windows. At first, it looked like condensation, but when we checked closely, we realized they were handprints. It was clear someone had been trying to force the windows open. My dad wanted to call the cops, but my mom insisted it would sound ridiculous. There wasn't any real damage, just creepy signs someone had been there. We spent the day reinforcing the locks and adding extra security. Even though we tried to move on, we couldn't shake the feeling that Mark had something to do with it. We never heard from him again. It was like he vanished into thin air, leaving us with questions that still haunt me to this day. I never thought Christmas night could turn out so terrifying. It was around 9 p.m., and I was home with my 2 kids, ages 4 and 7. My husband was working late, so it was just the 3 of us, trying to keep the holiday spirit alive. The Christmas tree lights were twinkling in the corner of the living room, and I was finishing up putting some presents under the tree when I heard knocks at the door. They weren't soft knocks. They were firm and insistent, the kind that makes your heart race immediately. Who knocks on your door this late, especially on Christmas? I walked to the door, feeling uneasy, and asked who it was. A man's voice answered, saying he was Santa Claus and that he was delivering gifts to the neighborhood kids. That already felt strange because no one in the neighborhood had mentioned anything about this. When I peeked through the peephole, I saw a man in a cheap-looking Santa suit, his face partially covered by a fake beard. Something about him felt off. He was holding a bag and motioning for me to open the door, saying he just needed a minute to drop off the gifts. My gut told me not to open it, so I thanked him and said we didn't need anything, but he kept insisting, claiming it was a tradition and that my kids would love it. I was already uncomfortable, but his tone started to change. He sounded more impatient, almost annoyed, and kept knocking, this time louder. My kids, who were sitting on the couch watching a cartoon, started asking who it was, and I told them to stay quiet. My heart was racing. Something about this guy felt very wrong, but he kept talking like he was trying to convince me. Just open the door, it's quick. I won't take long. I tried to sound firm and told him we were fine, but he knocked again, even harder. At that point, I started to feel real panic. I decided to call my husband. He was only a few minutes away, driving home from work, and I quickly explained what was going on. He told me to lock all the doors and wait for him. Meanwhile, the man outside wouldn't stop. Now he was saying things like, "If you don't open the door, you're being very rude on Christmas." His persistence felt more and more threatening, but I forced myself to stay calm so I wouldn't scare the kids. I grabbed a kitchen knife and stood near the door, trying to listen for any other noises outside. Time felt like it was crawling as I waited for my husband. The knocking kept going, but then, all of a sudden, it stopped. My first reaction was relief, but almost instantly, a wave of fear hit me. Why did he stop? The house was dead silent except for the sound of the TV in the living room. I tried looking out the side window, but I didn't see anything. That only made me more nervous. I stood there, gripping the knife tightly, straining to hear any noise, footsteps, voices, anything that might tell me what was going on. A few minutes later, I heard the familiar sound of my husband's car pulling into the driveway. I ran to the window and saw the headlights illuminating the yard. When he got out of the car, I felt a huge wave of relief, but I was still on edge. I opened the door as soon as he reached it and quickly explained what had happened. He took a look around, but there was no sign of anyone. Once he came inside and we locked everything up again, I finally felt like I could breathe. The rest of the night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The next morning, still feeling uneasy, I decided to check our security cameras. My husband had installed them not long ago, and it was the first thing that came to mind. When I opened the app and started reviewing the footage, my heart started racing again. There he was, the man in the Santa suit, standing at the door, exactly how I remembered. He looked restless, glancing around between knocks. But what sent chills down my spine was noticing something I hadn't realized the night before. There was a car parked further down the street, almost hidden by the shadow of a tree. At first, I thought it was just random, but as I rewound the footage and watched more closely, it became clear it wasn't. Two men were sitting inside the car. One of them stepped out for a few seconds and seemed to be watching the house, while the other stayed behind the wheel. That's when I realized the man dressed as Santa wasn't acting alone. His persistence in getting me to open the door was clearly part of a bigger plan. My blood ran cold as I kept watching the footage. The plan was obvious. The guy dressed as Santa was just the distraction while the other two waited, ready to act the moment I opened the door. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had hesitated or ignored my instincts. I showed the recordings to my husband, and he was just as shaken as I was. We called the police right away, but since nothing actually happened, they said all they could do was file a report. Still, the officer agreed that it looked like a planned home invasion. To this day, I can't get the details of that night out of my head. Anytime I see someone dressed as Santa, I'm reminded of that cheap costume, the half-covered face, and that insistent, unsettling voice. I've never felt completely safe in my house since then, especially at night. I don't know who those men were or what exactly they had planned, but I know something terrible was avoided that night. We've taken every precaution we can since, but the fear of it happening again has never fully gone away. You know that instant regret feeling? That's exactly how I felt when Christmas night turned into a complete nightmare. I was spending the holiday alone, like every other year, and decided to hit up a bar nearby just to break the monotony. That's where I met this woman named Carla, or at least that's what she said her name was. She seemed super friendly, really easy to talk to, and we hit it off pretty quickly. I'm not the kind of guy who invites strangers over, but maybe the holiday spirit or just plain loneliness got the best of me. I suggested she join me for dinner at my place, and she agreed without hesitation. Looking back, that should have been my first red flag. We got to my apartment around 8 p.m., and everything seemed normal at first. We whipped up a simple dinner, pasta and wine, nothing fancy. The conversation was going well, but then she started asking these weird, overly personal questions. First, it was about my family, why I was spending Christmas alone, and if anyone was planning to visit. Then she moved on to my job, how much I earned, if I traveled a lot. It still felt like casual curiosity at that point. But then she asked if I ever left my doors or windows unlocked at night. That's when I felt my first chill. Who asks something like that during dinner? I tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. Even made a joke about being bad with home security, but by then, my instincts were kicking in. She laughed it off, but it felt like she was paying way too much attention to my answers. A little later, she offered to refill my wine, and that's when I noticed something else odd. She made sure my glass was full, but she barely touched hers. It was subtle, but enough to make me start connecting dots. Despite the growing unease, I drank the wine. Not long after, I started feeling sluggish, not drunk, just off. My body felt heavy, and my vision started to blur. I knew something was wrong, but I played it cool. I told her I was feeling really tired and suggested she call a cab or something since it was getting late. That's when she mentioned her brother was on his way to pick her up and that she just needed a few more minutes. That comment sent my panic into overdrive. I excused myself, saying I needed to lie down. but I went straight to my bedroom, locked the door, and grabbed my phone. I could hear her pacing around the living room, talking quietly on the phone with someone. From the bedroom, I heard a car pull up outside, followed by quick footsteps on the driveway. My heart was pounding. A moment later, there were knocks at the door and a man's voice calling her name. They were talking low, but I caught something like, "Did he drink enough?" My head was spinning by this point, but adrenaline was keeping me focused. Quietly, I locked every door and window I could reach. Then, I heard the doorknob turning. They were trying to get in. I ran back to the bedroom and called the police, talking as fast as I could while trying to stay calm. As I was explaining everything, the knocks on the door turned into loud banging. She was yelling for me to open up, saying it was just her brother coming to pick her up. I didn't respond. That's when the banging got even louder, like they were trying to force their way in. I barricaded the bedroom door with a chair, shaking the whole time, and prayed the locks would hold until the cops showed up. The next few minutes felt like hours. I could hear them arguing outside, and the banging on the door stopped. Maybe they realized the door was tougher than they expected. Or maybe they heard me on the phone and panicked. Then, suddenly, it got quiet. Too quiet. I didn't dare go check. I stayed in the bedroom, clutching my phone, and waiting for the sound of sirens to tell me help was on the way. Finally, I heard the police pulling up, and my body almost gave out from relief. They knocked on the door, announcing themselves, but I didn't come out right away. I peeked through the window to make sure it was actually them. Once I was certain, I unlocked the door and the officers came in to search the place. By then, the woman and her so-called brother were gone. They had vanished without a trace. I told the cops everything, and one of them said this wasn't the first time they'd heard about this kind of setup. That comment sent chills down my spine. After the police left, I just sat on my couch, trying to wrap my head around what had happened. My body still felt off from whatever she put in the wine, but fear and adrenaline kept me wide awake. I stayed up the entire night with every single light in the apartment on C, jumping at every little sound outside. The scariest part, they didn't try to steal anything. That meant their plan was probably something much worse than robbery. Even now, I can't believe I was stupid enough to invite a stranger into my home. But who would think someone would use Christmas night to pull something so twisted? That night completely changed me. I've since installed security cameras, replaced all my locks, and I don't trust anyone I meet anymore, no matter how friendly they seem. Still, I get paranoid whenever I hear footsteps outside or see a car slow down near my house. That night taught me a hard lesson, but at least I'm here to share it. Spending Christmas in a remote cabin sounded like the perfect plan. We rented a cozy house surrounded by snow, big enough for all of us to hang out and have fun. We arrived full of energy, each bringing gifts for a secret Santa exchange. The house had that warm, woodsy smell of old furniture and a fireplace, which made everything feel even more festive. After dinner, we started exchanging gifts. There was laughter, guessing who brought what, and everything felt normal, until someone found a strange gift hidden under the tree. When they opened it, the mood in the room shifted instantly. Inside the package was an old porcelain doll, dressed in a faded, vintage outfit. Her glass eyes reflected the flickering firelight, and she had this eerie, cracked face. But the creepiest part was the handwritten note attached to the wrapping. It read, "Thank you for letting me in." At first, we thought it was a prank, but nobody admitted to bringing it. We tried to laugh it off and continue with the gift exchange, but the uneasy feeling lingered. A little while later, one of my friends went to the kitchen to grab more drinks and came back pale, saying the back door was unlocked. That didn't make sense because we had made sure to lock all the doors when we arrived. When we went to check, the door was slightly open, and outside, in the fresh snow, were footprints leading straight to the door. The strangest thing, there were no footprints leaving. We tried convincing ourselves it was just old tracks covered by snow, but no one really believed that. We went back to the living room, but the cheerful Christmas vibe was gone. The doll, which we had left on the table, seemed more unsettling than before. Someone suggested wrapping it back up and leaving it outside, but no one wanted to touch it. So we just left it where it was and tried to distract ourselves. That's when it happened. The fire in the fireplace, which had been burning strong, suddenly dimmed, like someone had blown on it. The air in the room felt colder immediately, and not just because the fire had weakened. It was like the atmosphere itself had shifted. Then we heard it, a faint noise from upstairs. It wasn't loud, but it sounded like soft, deliberate footsteps. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances, but nobody wanted to be the first to speak. Finally, one of my friends, trying to sound rational, suggested we go up together and check. Reluctantly, we agreed, grabbing our phones for flashlights. As we climbed the stairs, every step felt heavier than the last. At the top, we saw one door slightly ajar, the room where we had stored our bags. Slowly, we pushed the door open. The room looked just like we had left it, except for one thing. The doll was now sitting in the middle of the bed. None of us had moved it upstairs, and yet there it was, with its empty, glassy eyes staring right at us. We backed out of the room, shut the door, and hurried downstairs without saying a word. Back in the living room, we decided to lock all the doors again, just to be sure, and stuck together by the fireplace. No one wanted to admit how freaked out we were, but it was obvious. Then we heard a loud bang. The back door had somehow opened on its own. We ran to the kitchen and found it wide open, the cold wind whipping through the house. The footprints in the snow were even clearer this time, and alongside them was a drag mark, like something heavy had been pulled toward the house. We slammed the door shut and blocked it with a chair. As we turned back toward the living room, our hearts stopped. The doll was no longer upstairs. It was now on the floor in the middle of the room. Nobody had gone near it, and yet there it was, sitting there like it had been waiting for us. Seeing the doll in the middle of the room was too much. One of my friends tried to pick it up to throw it outside, but stopped halfway, visibly shaken. "It feels wrong," he said, backing away like the doll was radiating something sinister. We all stood there, staring at it, too scared to get closer. Someone suggested we just leave it and try to wait out the night, but that felt impossible. Every shadow, every creak in the house seemed like it was alive, watching us. We decided to try the front door, but when we turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was like it had been locked from the inside, even though none of us had used the key. Desperation started to set in, and one of my friends grabbed a chair, trying to smash the nearest window, but the glass didn't break, no matter how hard he hit it. It was as if the house itself was refusing to let us leave. Then we heard it, steps coming from upstairs again, this time heavier, more deliberate. Frozen in place, we listened as the footsteps moved across the ceiling, then stopped directly above us. Nobody dared to say a word. Then, all at once, the fire in the fireplace flared up, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. And there it was again, the note. It was lying on the floor next to the doll, but now the message had changed. In shaky handwriting, it read, "I'm already here." At that point, we were done. Someone grabbed the keys, and we all bolted for the back door, no longer caring about the snow or the cold. It felt like we were being chased as we ran to the car, barely pausing to breathe. We didn't look back, not once. We left the house exactly as it was, and none of us ever went back. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but every Christmas since, I can't help but think about that doll and what might have been watching us that night. If you enjoyed the stories, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support our work, and never miss the next ones. Thank you.